There is something about an empath's disappearance that unsettles people in ways they do not know how to explain. Because people are used to noise. They understand anger. They understand confrontation. So they understand tears, accusations, slam doors, block numbers, and final messages written in emotional fire. Noise gives closure. Noise gives people something to fight against. Noise gives them a story where they can still feel in control. But an empath rarely leaves that way. An empath leaves in the most terrifying way possible, with nothing. No final argument to defend themselves. No list of wounds they endured. No dramatic performance to make others feel guilty. They simply stop showing up. And that absence begins to speak louder than any scream ever could. At first, people assume it is temporary. They think they'll come back. They always do. Because empaths have a history of returning to places that hurt them. Returning after disrespect. Returning after betrayal. Returning after being emotionally drained to the bone. They return because they understand pain. They return because they believe in healing. They return because they keep hoping the love they give will eventually be reciprocated. But there comes a day when something inside them shifts. Not loudly, not visibly, not the way anyone notices at first. It happens quietly, in the middle of one more disappointment, one more broken promise, one more night of lying awake, trying to make sense of people who only know how to take. And in that quiet moment, a dangerous realization is born. I cannot keep abandoning myself to keep others. That sentence changes everything, because the empath finally sees the truth they spent years avoiding. That compassion without boundaries becomes self-destruction. That understanding toxic people does not heal toxic people. That loyalty to the wrong souls becomes betrayal of the self. And once that truth settles into the nervous system, something sacred begins to die. The need to explain, the need to chase, the need to convince, the need to be seen by those committed to misunderstanding them. This is why their silence feels so brutal, because it is not the silence of confusion anymore. It is the silence of clarity. Then something even more painful happens. People who benefited from the empath's endless patience begin to panic, not because they suddenly value the empath's heart, but because they can feel access slipping away. The free emotional labor, the unconditional forgiveness, the late night availability, the one person who kept making excuses for behavior that should never have been tolerated. When that disappears, people feel lost, but not always love, and that distinction matters. Because many only miss an empath when the empath stops absorbing damage for them. And from the outside, it can feel sudden. It can feel cold. It can feel like something meaningful was abandoned without warning. But what most people don't see, what they rarely understand, is that for the empath, it was never sudden. It was building for a long time, quietly, gradually, in ways that didn't always have words at first. Because empaths are not the kind of people who walk away easily. They are not the ones who leave at the first sign of difficulty. In fact, they are often the ones who stay far longer than they should. They stay through confusion. They stay through inconsistency. They stay through moments where something feels off, but they can't quite explain why. And they stay because they believe in connection. They believe in understanding. They believe that if they just listen more, care more, try a little harder, something will shift. So when an empath disappears, it's not because they didn't try. It's because they tried for too long. You see, an empath doesn't just experience interactions on the surface. They feel the undercurrents, the tone behind the words, the subtle shifts in energy, the things that are said and the things that are avoided. And at first, they often give those signals the benefit of the doubt. They tell themselves, oh, maybe I'm overthinking. They say, everyone has bad days. They try to rationalize what doesn't quite make sense because they don't want to jump to conclusions. But the patterns don't disappear. They repeat. And each time they do, the empath feels it, even if they don't fully acknowledge it right away. They feel the inconsistency. They feel the emotional distance. They feel the moments where their presence is valued and the moments where it is not. And over time, those feelings begin to accumulate. Not in a loud, confrontational way, but in a quiet awareness, an awareness that something is not aligned, that something is being given without being returned in the same way, that something is being asked of them without being respected in return. And still, they stay, because empaths don't just connect to people. They connect to potential. They see what could be. They see the moments of kindness, the glimpses of depth, the possibility of something real, and they hold on to that, even when the reality in front of them doesn't consistently match it. But here's where the truth begins, because there comes a point where the empath can no longer ignore what they feel, not because they suddenly become less patient, but because they become more aware. They start to recognize that understanding someone does not mean accepting everything. That compassion does not require self-abandonment, that staying is not always the same as loving, and that realization doesn't happen overnight. It builds. Through repeated experiences, through moments where they feel drained instead of connected, through conversations that leave them more confused than clear, through the slow erosion of their own energy. And eventually, something inside them changes. It's not dramatic, it's not loud, it's a quiet shift. A moment where they stop trying to make sense of what doesn't make sense. A moment where they stop over-explaining, over-giving, overextending. A moment where they realize that their presence has been constant, but the connection has not. And that moment is where the disappearance begins. Not outwardly at first. Internally, they start to pull back emotionally. They become less reactive, less invested in trying to fix or figure things out. They observe more, they speak less. They begin to detach, and not out of anger, but out of clarity. And this is often the part that goes unnoticed. Because from the outside, they may still be there, still responding, still engaging, at least on the surface. But something has shifted. They are no longer giving from the same place. They are no longer holding on in the same way. And when that internal shift reaches a certain point, the external shift follows. They stop reaching out. They stop initiating. They stop trying to maintain a connection that feels one-sided. And then they disappear. Not as a punishment, not as a game, but as a form of self-preservation. Because by the time an empath leaves without warning, they have already had countless internal conversations. They have already tried to make sense of things. They have already given opportunities, often more than were recognized. They have already felt the weight of staying. And they have reached a point where staying feels more harmful than leaving. But here's the part that is often misunderstood. Their silence is not a lack of care. It is the result of caring too much for too long without being met in the same way. Their absence is not indifference. It is the outcome of emotional exhaustion. And their disappearance is not about avoiding communication. It is about recognizing that communication was no longer leading to clarity. Because in many narcissistic or emotionally imbalanced dynamics, communication becomes circular. You express how you feel and it gets redirected. You try to address an issue and it gets minimized. You seek understanding and you are met with defensiveness or dismissal. And over time, the empath realizes something important. That not every conversation leads to resolution. That not every person is willing or able to meet them in a space of mutual understanding. And that realization changes how they approach the situation. They stop trying to explain themselves to someone who is committed to misunderstanding them. They stop seeking closure from a dynamic that thrives on confusion. They stop investing energy into something that continues to drain them. And instead, they choose something else. Distance, not because it's easy, but because it's necessary. And that distance allows something to happen that wasn't possible before. They begin to hear themselves again. Their own thoughts, their own needs, their own feelings, without the constant influence of someone else's behavior. And in that space, clarity deepens. They start to see the patterns more clearly. They recognize how often they were overextending, how often they were minimizing their own discomfort, how often they were trying to maintain something that required constant effort, but offered little stability. And with that clarity comes a sense of grounding, a reconnection to themselves. They begin to rebuild their sense of identity outside of the relationship. They reconnect with what they value, what they need, what feels healthy and aligned. And as that process continues, something else begins to shift. Their tolerance changes. What they once accepted no longer feels acceptable. What they once overlooked now stands out clearly. What they once tried to fix, they now recognize as something that is not theirs to carry. And this is where their growth becomes evident, not in dramatic declarations, but in quiet decisions, choosing not to go back, choosing not to re-engage in the same patterns, choosing to protect their peace, even when it means being misunderstood. Because they understand something now that they didn't fully understand before, that their energy is valuable, that their presence is not something to be taken for granted, that their empathy is a strength, but only when it is balanced with boundaries. And that understanding becomes their foundation moving forward. It shapes how they engage in relationships. It influences the kind of connections they are willing to invest in. It guides them toward dynamics that are mutual, respectful, and emotionally safe. And while their disappearance may feel sudden to others, for them, it is the result of a long journey, a journey of awareness, of emotional clarity, of recognizing that staying in a situation that diminishes them is not an act of love. It is an act of self-abandonment. And choosing to leave, even without explanation, is an act of self-respect. It is the moment where they stop prioritizing being understood by others and start honoring what they already understand within themselves. And that choice, while quiet, carries a profound kind of strength. Because it reflects a shift from external validation to internal clarity, from overgiving to self-preservation, from confusion to truth. And that truth stays with them in the way they move forward, in the way they choose relationships, in the way they show up, not just for others, but for themselves. What was it? And even though their absence may leave questions behind for them, it leaves something else entirely. A sense of peace they didn't have before. A sense of alignment that no longer requires them to explain, justify, or overextend. A sense of self that is no longer defined by how much they can give, but by how well they can honor their own needs. And that is what people often don't see when an empath disappears. It's not just an ending. It's a beginning. Oh, a quiet, powerful beginning that starts the moment they choose themselves over a dynamic that asks them to be anything but.